So there has never been a time where there is more bodybuilding information readily available to you in the history of humanity apart from right now, except for right now, because there's more information over time. And I think for a lot of people, it might be too much information. A lot of people are thinking too much, but feeling too little. So today I want to talk to you about lifting wisdom, something that old guy in the gym has more of in his left foot than you have in your entire body. It is personal experience. It is not something that you read online in a study. It's not this exercise has 10% more EMG activation than this one. It is what you do in the gym and how that impacts future decisions. Now, Bruce Lee had this shit figured out. You ever heard, it is like a finger pointing its way to the moon? Don't miss all that heavenly glory by focusing on your finger. You got to look at the big picture. You can't get distracted by these tiny details. Don't think, feel.
Let me think. Don't think. Feel.
And I'm not thinking during a set. I'm feeling. I'm squeezing, stretching, pumping, pushing. Sounds like I'm giving birth, and I am giving birth to these gains. But I have noticed a lot of people, they are not feeling, they are thinking. They have a million different cues. They watched 18 different squat videos before they went in there, all of which had conflicting advice. Knees forward, but also hips back, but also legs apart, sitting down between the legs, but also with the narrow stance, while also keeping braced, but also not overextended, but also hitting full depth, but also keeping tension on the quads, and also keeping the chest up. And it just turns into a complete fucking mess. A lot of coaches or online content creators, they want to provide value. That's what they do for a living. However, I think in a lot of cases, this results in an over-cueing mess where a beginner is going to go nowhere because they are just so up in their own head that they forget how to actually push a set. And maybe not even forget, they just never learn. And I've seen people do sets where I'm like, all right, cool, they're getting into the set. Cool, we're getting a few reps away from, they just stopped. And then I asked them about it, and they're like, oh, well, I lost my mind-muscle connection, bro, or I was losing tension in that area, or, my delts took over the pull slightly, and so I had to stop it, or, the blood lactate levels were elevating a little bit, my respiration was becoming the limiting factor, and a lot of these things are just excuses. They are just reasons to not push a set. And a lot of these newer movements are simply easier. And that should be a reason to push them even harder. I mean, if you're keeping 1 or 2 or 3 reps in reserve on your RDLs or your squats, fair enough, fair play. I think that actually makes sense. But when you're doing the same thing for your iliac pull down or your one arm extension or some kind of hyper optimized curl, I think that doesn't really make a lot of sense. You need to be pushing these even harder to make up for the fact that they are inherently easier. And finding your exercise selection and your exercise technique is going to take some time. It involves actually going into the gym and trying stuff. You don't know the results before that process. A lot of people, they're trying to sort of determine the outcome before they even try, and that's just not possible. You cannot sit in your room and read studies or consume fitness content, yes, even my fitness content, and get the outcome before you actually try. That process is irreplaceable, and you don't know the outcome before you actually go through that. And some people, they have not so strict technique. Other people have extremely strict technique. If someone is advanced and they've gone through that process, generally I shut the fuck up. You won't hear me criticize advanced lifters' techniques in most cases. Sometimes if it's egregious, but it is so individual, and if they've already gone through that process and they've gotten results when doing it, hey, fair play. But when there's a beginner who is just copying someone else's technique and just copy pasting it into their own plan, that is where I think criticism is warranted, and having maybe a little bit more of an exploratory approach and experimenting with your technique, different tempos, different hand positions on the bar, different foot stances when you're squatting, different depths when you're squatting. Yes, not going ass to grass might actually be a good situation if you want to grow the quads. Maybe Ronnie was right. I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't criticize the greatest bodybuilder of all time. I don't know. Am I crazy? Am I crazy? Am I the crazy one here? Range of motion, tempo, even exercise selection itself. When I see a study that says, oh, preacher curls are better than incline dumbbell curls, by now I have enough experience where I'm not like, oh my God, have I done things wrong? Have I been messing up my training the whole time? Well, no, because I've done both and I know the value of both and their place in my training for me. And just because you see better results for a certain exercise compared to another, that doesn't mean it's going to be the case for everyone, and you might not be in the majority. Lifting wisdom is finding your way, not the way of the average. And so often, science is just showing you the average. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's usually a fine starting point, but it's a pretty shitty ending point in a lot of cases. Next, injury management and avoidance. Now, if you're a beginner, you're probably like, what are you talking about? When you're more advanced, you're like, yep. I was watching Jordan Peters' video the other day, and who's an absolute fucking savage, by the way. Yes, enhanced, obviously, but, whatever. And he said that, I pulled this for 1 or 2 reps, and then I stopped because I knew if I kept pulling, I would have gotten injured. And I think a lot of beginners would be like, well, how do you know if you would have gotten injured? Whereas more advanced guys are like, yep, I've been there, brother. I've been there, brother. By the way, this video is sponsored by Boostcamp. So I think you should not overthink your training, but you should be keeping a training log. I'm always shocked by how many people, they just don't write anything down. They have no idea what they did last week, let alone last month. And progression is one of those few things that is actually very, very important. And Boostcamp is the best way to do that. Plus, it gives you access to some of the best programs. If you are overthinking writing your own program and you don't really know what to do, hop on a fixed plan. You can assess and evaluate over time and modify it to your needs as you gain experience. But hop on something that you know is going to be solid and works. You can check out Ravage, Rampage, or my Recovering Power Lifter program. Those are all going to be very, very good programs for you. They will treat you right. And thank you to Boostcamp for sponsoring this video. And the other day I was doing leg presses and I felt my left adductor more and more with every single rep. Now, 5 years ago, I would have been like, nah, another rep. You gotta go to failure. You gotta go to 0 reps in reserve. But now I'm like, all right, well, nope, that does not, you keep that shit away from me. And so sometimes you can feel something not so good potentially happening. Now, that doesn't mean I would have gotten injured. Maybe I just picked up a very slight strain instead of a complete tear. There's no way to know what could happen, but keep in mind that it takes thousands of reps to make you, but only 1 rep to break you. And sometimes getting broken is a major pain in the ass, requiring either a lot of time off or changing your exercise selection or even surgery. So if you feel something during a set in one specific area, that could be an issue. Now, if a beginner says, I feel squats here, and they point to their quads, I'm like, is it exactly here or is it like the whole thing? If it's kind of just the whole thing, you're probably fine. But if someone is advanced and they're like, I stopped the set because I felt my pec right here, yeah, I would be careful with that. And a lot of beginners will say stuff like, nah, it's just what your body is prepared for in terms of injury. You can adapt to anything. Well, I think you can adapt to a lot, but sometimes there are just some exercises that are just not worth doing. There are better alternatives, and it's not worth doing a movement that kind of bangs you up and beats you up and provides a similar benefit to something else that does not bang you up or beat you up. Another important aspect of lifting wisdom is autoregulation. And I typically look at this as how much volume you should do on a day. Perhaps you have a range of 2 to 3 sets, or 2 to 4 sets, or 3 to 4 sets, or 3 to 5 sets, or whatever. But it is more than that, because it is also maybe potentially keeping reps in reserve. It is maybe potentially changing exactly how you perform an exercise. It might even be not doing a certain exercise on this day and doing something else instead. Now, I think you still want a pretty good structure for your training. I don't think just going in and being like, what should I do today? I don't think that makes a lot of sense when you actually want to progress. Maybe if you're maintaining and you're 45, 50 years old, and you're not really going to gain anything else and you're just sort of happy to maintain, I think, completely instinctive training is fine. But I think for most people, you want a structure, but then also a decent amount of wiggle room within that structure. I've had times where I loaded up a weight for an exercise, and then I kind of thought about it, and I was like, no, and I reduced the weight. I used to never do that because I loaded up the weight and now I have to do it, either from my own judgment or other people's judgment. Let me tell you, other people don't give a shit. If I saw someone load up a weight, kind of look at that and be like, hey, yeah, I'm going to take some weight off the road, I'd be like, damn, respect. He knows his limits and he doesn't give a shit what other people think. That is wisdom. That is knowing yourself. And a lot of beginners, they don't know themselves. They just know a lot of pieces of information. Also, in your program, sometimes you keep a movement in and then you swap it out for something else. That's a pretty common way of doing things, and it's something that I advocate. How do you know when to move exercises? How do you know when to change to something else? Well, you have to auto-regulate. You have to go by feel. You have to know when the juice is no longer worth the squeeze. When, this movement, it was hitting really well a month ago, but now it feels a little bit stale, and it just isn't really providing the same benefit as it used to. Now, you don't want to swap as soon as progression slows, because that slow progression is when you're actually making real progress. But at a certain point, some movements are just not as good as they used to be, and something else is better. I wrote this in my latest book, where every movement is always competing for a place in your plan. You are this stud, and all these exercises are competing for your attention, and only a few get that attention.
With how strong of a connection we've built in such a short period of time. Knew early on that there was something different about you, and I just wanted to learn more. But there is nothing difficult about choosing you. That I love you.
So if you're advanced, you know when to call a set in proximity to failure. You know when to call an exercise. Okay, I did 2 sets of RDLs and I am cooked. I don't need a third. Or sometimes you don't push the first 2 as hard. Maybe you're still kind of warming up. And yeah, you need a third or even a fourth. And so, yeah, sometimes you use 2 sets or 3 or 4, depending on how things go. You're making decisions in the moment, not based on something you read online before. This is something that you really can only do by feel. Now, we have the ability to go by feel in a lot of other areas. We don't need to concentrate on breathing. It kind of just happens. If you're sleeping and the temperature is a certain degree, well, how high do you pull up the covers? Do you pull them up super high? Oh, now it's too hot. You stick out a leg and cool off a little bit. Oh, I cooled off too much. I'm gonna put the covers back over my thigh. We have this ability to do often unconsciously, but when it comes to your training, this ability kind of has to be developed, and it can really only be developed from fucking it up. I've had times when I penciled in standing cable pullovers at the end of a workout, but I did not need that shit. I was already fine in terms of stimulus. And again, that can really only be felt through experience, through either doing too much or doing too little and not seeing the results that you wanted. And lifting wisdom is also knowing the importance of various factors. So it's knowing that, hey, this detail, it doesn't matter at all. This one matters a little bit, but only under some context. This one, it matters sometimes, but only on some movements. This one doesn't matter at all. This one matters a ton. So a lot of beginners, they have all this information kind of just tossed at them. And by tossed, I mean they kind of go out of their way to consume it, but they don't know which is actually important. They don't know, if you set the incline degree this much or this much, like in a year, it won't actually matter very much. They don't know that, if you eat beef or chicken in a year, like it doesn't actually fucking matter. But those extra 2-3 reps that you're keeping in reserve and you should be taking, that absolutely will matter. The fact that you skip meals all the time and you're actually in a deficit when you should be in a surplus, yeah, that matters. So there are some things that matter much more than others, and knowing that hierarchy is extremely important. And you don't really know that hierarchy unless it is explained to you. Unfortunately, that is boring as shit, and talking about the basics simply doesn't do as well on social media. Whereas finding this new movement or this tiny detail that is, of course, going to revolutionize your training, that tends to go viral. And in a lot of ways, the incentive structures for content creation are absolutely awful. And I say this as someone who is in the thick and thin of things and sees which topics do well. And often the topics that do well are not actually important. They are not something that is actually going to benefit you, but you have to talk a big game in the thumbnail, in the title, in the intro, through the mid-range to keep people watching. And then sometimes near the end, content creators will be like, oh, by the way, make sure you're eating and sleeping and training hard and all those other way more important things. But sometimes you don't even get that nuance at all. And so people are often hyper-focusing on these details that in a lot of cases don't even matter to the advanced lifter. I get a lot of DMs, a lot of questions, and often I don't even track it. When people are like, so do you keep 2 or 2.5 minutes rest intervals between sets? I'm like, I don't track. And I can kind of see them be like, I've been timing everything. And I could see them respond to me saying that I don't worry or focus or even measure or manage these details. And I can kind of see them having a little bit of an existential crisis on the other end of the Instagram DM. They're kind of like flustered, like, he doesn't track his protein? Like, what? Why am I not seeing a result? It's probably not how much protein you're eating. And one of the ways that you can tell if someone is a good source of information is if they stack things well. If they say, okay, this is really important, this is quite important, this is somewhat important under some circumstances, this is probably not worth focusing on, this does absolutely nothing. And a lot of content creators just don't do that. And you don't have to do it every video, but it just doesn't really pay to do things that way. And the reality is content creators are not paid from your success. They are paid from your views. Another aspect of lifting wisdom is enjoyment. And I can't tell you how many times someone asked me, hey, why are you doing this movement over this one? This one was found to have more growth in a study or EMG or whatever. And I just said, hey, well, I like this one though. And I could kind of see them thinking like, I guess that's a factor as well. Of course it's a fucking factor. I lift, at least in large part, for enjoyment because that makes it more sustainable. And doing a program that you hate is probably just not worth doing. You're probably not even going to put the same amount of effort into it. And that might actually make your optimal program suboptimal. Now, if these optimal movements get you fired up and ready to go, well, maybe they are optimal. And I have implemented a lot of these in my training because they are new, they are novel, and they feel good. And if that gets you motivated and going to the gym, hell yeah. But if you get a lot more interested in how many pull-ups you can do, that might actually be optimal. And you're going to mess up your training. It's going to happen. You're going to have training blocks where you look back and you're like, I don't think that did anything at all. Or you're going to have sets that you look back and you're like, that was a bad idea. You might get hurt. You might get injured. You might have to take time off. It's going to be a bumpy road, and it's not just going to be a linear line. Fucking words, bro. Or even a non-linear line. It might not even be the classic, I gained this much in year 1, this much in year 2, this much in year 3. We've all seen these charts where it's like, this is how much you're going to gain. How do you know? You might have years where you gain nothing. Like, I look back at 2020, I don't think I gained anything that year. The first part of the year was kind of a mess. Then the second part, I was, just wasn't as productive. And you're going to have years that just aren't as good. And that's totally okay as long as you're learning something from them and compiling your pile of wisdom. In a lot of ways, lifting wisdom centers yourself. So a lot of beginners, there's this new trend, this new exercise, this is the new thing, high volume, low volume, high intensity training, you got to eat these foods, liver is a new thing. And they are kind of just constantly chasing the new thing. Once you've been in the game for a while, first of all, you know that this new thing is probably not new. A lot of these things, they're just repeats. It's the same TV show played over and over again. Second of all, you've probably done that shit and decided if it doesn't or does work for you. And third of all, you kind of have your own thing going now. So this new study comes out about this new movement, and you're like, oh, cool. But I already know what works for me, and maybe I'll try it, maybe I won't. I'll get around to it on my own fucking time. That is wisdom. I mean, it's part of the reason why supplements are peddled at beginners. Beginners are like, oh my god, this thing is 300% more muscle activation from protein synthesis from this. And the advanced guy's like, all right, well, I'll check back in a decade or two when they have some actual data behind it that wasn't funded only by this company. So hopefully this video helped. I'm not saying you shouldn't think about your training. I'm not saying you shouldn't try to consume fitness content or get more information or quote unquote optimize your training, but it needs to be balanced with actually going in there on a regular basis, feeling and seeing what is actually going to work for you. These things need to be balanced. The thinking and the feeling, try to do more feeling when you're actually in the gym and keep the thinking to at a minimum between sets, but also between workouts as well. These two things, they can be your greatest ally, but also your worst enemy if misused or overused or underused. Anyway, for more information, which is actually useful and everything is in context and nuance and actually tells you what you need to know and doesn't tell you the things that you don't need to know, which is just as important, check out my books. I will leave them in a pinned comment down below. Reviews have been phenomenal. I've priced them extremely affordably. I've been asked why I don't charge more for them. It's because I guess I'm bad at business, but my stupidity is your gain, so check them out. Again, I will leave them in a pinned comment down below. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for the support, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.